So Tom Parker Bowles is sitting at a family dinner, and he decides that the best way to contribute to a conversation about Catherine's future is to suggest that she spent years cosplaying as William's late mother. And here's the thing, he doesn't even say it as if it's an insult. He says it like it's a compliment, as though he's giving her credit for a carefully executed performance. That's the part that makes it so much worse. You can argue with an accusation. You can push back against a direct insult. But when someone sits there and calmly explains that your wife's entire public identity is a carefully crafted imitation of your mother, what exactly are you supposed to do with that? William seemed to figure it out pretty quickly. He stood up, and the question he asked Tom afterward is the reason this story isn't just another awkward family dinner anecdote. It's a window into something that has apparently been simmering inside the family for quite some time. The evening started out normally enough. Charles was talking about the future of the monarchy, the responsibility gradually shifting to the younger generation, and how Catherine had handled pressure with the kind of steadiness the institution desperately needs right now. Someone else at the table pointed out that the public doesn't just admire Catherine. They trust her. That's an important distinction. Admiration is about image. Trust is about character. And that single word changed the atmosphere in the room. Tom Parker Bowles had been quiet throughout most of the conversation, listening but not really contributing. But as the discussion kept returning to Catherine, his silence started to feel less like disinterest and more like restraint. Then he finally spoke. At first, it sounded as though he was agreeing. Catherine understood the role exceptionally well. She knew exactly what people expected from a Princess of Wales. She knew when to speak, when to remain silent, how to dress without overpowering an occasion, and how to show emotion without allowing it to take control. Fair enough. All of that is true. Catherine has spent more than a decade learning how to navigate a role that comes with more public scrutiny than almost any other position in the world. But then Tom started listing things. The soft expressions, the understated clothing, the careful gestures around children, the controlled vulnerability during difficult moments. One detail after another. And while each observation seemed harmless on its own, together they began to feel less like simple comments and more like a deliberate argument. It was as if he were taking Catherine apart piece by piece and placing every part on the table for everyone to examine. Then he mentioned Diana, and that's when the room fell silent. He suggested that Catherine's enormous popularity existed partly because she had become exceptionally skilled at presenting the kind of princess Britain already knew how to love. And then he delivered the line that froze everyone at the table. She's been very successful at becoming the kind of princess people wanted to remember. Now, you could interpret that in several different ways. Maybe he meant that she had honored the legacy of the title. Maybe he meant that she carried herself with a dignity that reminded people of a more emotionally connected monarchy. But in the context of everything he had just said about her clothing, her gestures, and her carefully controlled emotions, the meaning seemed pretty obvious. He was suggesting that Catherine had studied Diana like a blueprint, that she had figured out what made people love Diana and intentionally built herself into that image. That's not a compliment. It's an accusation about her character disguised as an observation about her strategy. Catherine didn't respond, and somehow, that made the silence even heavier. She didn't challenge Tom. She didn't demand an apology. She didn't try to embarrass him. Her eyes lowered for a moment. Her hand paused beside her glass. Her expression remained completely controlled. But William knows her far too well to mistake composure for indifference. And Tom kept talking. Some women, he suggested, became beloved simply because of who they were. Others understood exactly what image people wanted to see. At that point, there was nothing subtle about it anymore. He was drawing a line between genuine affection and manufactured affection, and he was placing Catherine firmly in the second category. Her warmth became strategy. Her restraint became rehearsal. Her connection with people became performance. And this is where things become truly uncomfortable. Because these words came from Camilla's son. That changed the entire dynamic. If some random television commentator claimed that Catherine was performing Diana's legacy, it would just be background noise. But when the son of the woman who became William's stepmother, the woman who stood at the center of so much pain in Diana's life, sits at a family dinner and suggests that Catherine is imitating Diana, the implication becomes very different. It's no longer just an observation about public image. It's a judgment about Catherine's authenticity, and it carries an unspoken question. Was this really just Tom's opinion? Or had Catherine been discussed this way before, in conversations William wasn't there to hear? William looked at Catherine one more time. Then he turned back toward Tom. And here's the thing. Tom hadn't simply insulted his wife. He had taken the memory of William's mother and used it to question whether Catherine was genuine at all. That's a double violation. It undermines Catherine's character while using Diana's legacy as a weapon. The sound of William's chair scraping across the floor cut through the silence in the room. He stood up slowly, his anger measured but unmistakable. To understand why this affected William so deeply, you have to understand what Catherine has been dealing with since the very moment she entered royal life. She didn't just marry Prince William. She married the eldest son of Diana, Princess of Wales. And from the very beginning, every photograph seemed to invite the same comparison. Was there something of Diana in the clothing, in the smile, in the way she bent down to speak to a child, in the way people reacted when she walked into a room? A quote could become a headline. A gesture could become a side-by-side photograph placed next to one taken 20 years earlier. A hospital visit, a hand placed gently on someone's shoulder, a quiet interaction with a child. Even the way Catherine carried herself during a difficult public appearance could be turned into another story about the woman who once held the same title. And William witnessed all of it. He watched Catherine enter a family where his mother's memory wasn't a distant chapter in history. Diana was personal. She was the woman whose face William knew long before the world transformed her into an icon. She was a mother whose absence followed him into adulthood, into marriage, and eventually into fatherhood. William has spoken before about the fact that Catherine never knew Diana, which means she can't provide the kind of personal details their children sometimes ask about. So William talks to George about Diana himself. He keeps her memory alive in his own way. That's his responsibility, and Catherine has never tried to replace Diana. She's never needed to. William has made that clear for years. No one is trying to fill his mother's shoes. Catherine will create her own future and define her own path. But the pressure was already overwhelming. Without turning Diana into a competition, Catherine could never truly win. If she dressed differently, people noticed. If she wore something that reminded people of Diana, they noticed that too. If she showed emotion, the comparisons appeared. If she remained composed, the comparisons still appeared. There was no easy way to escape them. And that's why Tom's words carried such a specific kind of cruelty. He wasn't accusing Catherine of struggling beneath Diana's shadow. He was accusing her of using it. And that distinction changes everything. One is a burden she inherited. The other is a strategy she supposedly chose. There was another reason the accusation cut so deeply. Diana wasn't simply a famous predecessor whose style could be copied and eventually forgotten. She was William's mother. Any suggestion that Catherine had deliberately borrowed from her carried a level of personal intimacy that Tom couldn't separate from the family sitting around that table. And Tom wasn't an outside commentator making observations from a television studio. He was Queen Camilla's son, sitting within the same family circle and speaking directly in front of the man who had spent years protecting both Diana's memory and Catherine's place beside him. That gave his words an entirely different meaning. They were no longer comments coming from outside the palace. They had crossed into the family itself, spoken across a dinner table where everyone understood just how sensitive Diana's name still was. Across the table, Tom slowly rotated his glass between his fingers while Charles continued talking. Catherine listened without interrupting. William's eyes moved from his father to Tom, and then back to Catherine. Nothing dramatic happened. No one raised their voice. Not yet. But the conversation had reached the one subject Tom seemed unable to leave alone. Catherine's public standing. For years, the qualities people admired in her had seemed almost remarkably simple. She showed up. She remained calm. She chose her words carefully. She gave her full attention to the person standing in front of her. She handled scrutiny without turning every difficult moment into a story about herself. To William, those qualities weren't an act. They were the same private habits he had witnessed when the cameras weren't there. And that was the part Tom couldn't see. He didn't witness the quiet conversations before official engagements. He didn't see the moments when Catherine worried about making a mistake and then went out and fulfilled her duties anyway. He didn't feel the weight of stepping into a title permanently connected to a woman Britain still remembered with extraordinary affection. William did. And because he did, the suggestion that Catherine had studied Diana as though she were following a blueprint wasn't simply rude. It rewrote years of William's own experiences with her. It suggested that the woman standing beside him hadn't earned the public's trust through consistency. Instead, she had manufactured it. It suggested that her restraint was calculated, her warmth was selected, her public image had been carefully assembled piece by piece from memories that already belonged to someone else. That's why Catherine's silence mattered so much. She had spent years refusing to turn Diana into a rivalry. She had never needed to diminish William's mother to establish her own identity. She allowed the comparisons to come and go without fighting every headline, every photograph, and every whispered judgment. And now, Tom was preparing to argue the exact opposite. He was about to suggest that Catherine hadn't simply lived beneath Diana's shadow. She had learned how to use it. And the reason he pushed the conversation that far came down to a single word Charles had used earlier that evening when describing Catherine: trust. The dinner had reached the point in the evening when conversations usually became more relaxed. The plates had been cleared. The voices had softened. The atmosphere no longer felt ceremonial. It felt personal. Charles had been talking about the strain the family had carried over the years and the growing responsibility now resting on the younger generation. His tone was calm and measured, but his message was clear. The monarchy couldn't afford to appear distant. It needed figures the public still felt connected to. Naturally, Catherine's name entered the conversation. Charles spoke about resilience and the way she had continued to carry herself through immense pressure without allowing every difficult moment to become a public spectacle. Very little of what he said sounded exaggerated, and somehow, that made the praise even more powerful. Someone else at the table brought up the future. Not the next month, not the next royal engagement, the future of the monarchy itself. The discussion shifted toward William and Catherine, their children, and the way the younger Wales family had become a source of emotional connection for people who no longer followed every royal event. There was talk of school visits, public walkabouts, family appearances, and Catherine's unusual ability to make formal occasions feel more personal without breaking the traditions that held them together. Tom said nothing. He simply listened. Charles continued. Then another voice at the table made an observation. Catherine possessed something the institution couldn't manufacture through planning or public relations. The public trusted her. That single sentence changed the atmosphere. Tom looked up. He didn't challenge the comment directly. He didn't laugh. He didn't interrupt with anything openly hostile. Instead, he entered the conversation gently. Catherine, he said, certainly understood the role exceptionally well. No one reacted. On the surface, it was a perfectly reasonable statement. After all, Catherine had spent years learning the demands of royal life. She understood protocol, timing, presentation, and the discipline required to remain composed in rooms where every movement could become tomorrow's headline. Tom continued. She understood exactly what the public expected from a Princess of Wales. Still, there was nothing particularly controversial about what he was saying. Charles showed no sign of disagreement. Catherine remained attentive, but William was watching Tom more carefully now. There was still nothing in his words that demanded confrontation. Not yet. Then Tom began to explain what he meant. He started with the clothes. Understated, familiar, never too bold. Then he moved on to emotion. Controlled, visible enough to feel human, yet restrained enough to project stability. Then he mentioned the children. The way Catherine lowered herself to their level. The way she listened. The way photographs of those moments often traveled much farther than any formal speech ever could. Then came the warmth. The small gestures. The carefully timed pauses. The expressions that made people feel as though they had truly been seen. One observation followed another. Then another. Individually, none of those comments sounded offensive. Together, they began to sound very different. The conversation no longer felt like praise. It felt as though Tom was taking Catherine apart piece by piece and placing every detail under a microscope. William's attention sharpened. Camilla noticed it, too. The change was subtle but impossible to miss. What had begun as a discussion about Catherine's strengths was slowly turning into an argument about how those strengths had been constructed. Then Tom mentioned Diana. The room fell silent before he even finished the sentence. He suggested that Catherine's success came partly from understanding the emotional memory attached to the title she carried. Britain already knew what it wanted to feel when it looked at a Princess of Wales. Certain gestures worked, certain qualities resonated, certain images stayed with people, and then he delivered the line. She's been very successful at becoming the kind of princess people wanted to remember. Silence. Not outrage. Not yet. The sentence simply hung in the air. Catherine looked down. Her fingers paused beside her glass. She didn't pick it up. She didn't respond. William looked at her and then back at Tom. Across the table, Camilla's eyes shifted toward William. She had noticed the change in his expression. The warmth had disappeared. Charles stopped speaking. Tom finally seemed to realize that the room hadn't received his observation as the clever insight he thought it was. So he pushed further. Some women, he suggested, were loved simply because of who they were. Others became loved because they understood exactly what image people wanted people to see. That was the moment the meaning became impossible to soften. Catherine was no longer being praised for understanding duty. She was being accused of understanding performance. Her connection with people was no longer instinct. It was strategy. Her restraint was no longer character. It was calculation. The room had become so quiet that every small sound suddenly seemed amplified. Tom tried to explain. He said he was talking about public image, about presentation, about the way modern royalty functioned. He kept adding context to words that no longer needed any explanation. It was too late. William had already heard enough. Catherine remained perfectly still, and somehow, that only made everything worse. She didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't give Tom an opportunity to hide behind a debate. She simply sat there, wounded but composed, while his explanation became weaker with every sentence. Tom kept talking. William stopped listening. Then William's chair scraped across the floor. He stood, but he didn't shout. And somehow, that made the moment even more uncomfortable. There was no fist slammed against the table. No dramatic gesture. No explosion of anger that could later be dismissed as nothing more than a loss of temper. He simply stood, looked directly at Tom Parker Bowles, and allowed the silence to settle before he finally spoke. "You do not speak about my wife like that." The sentence was quiet, and because it was quiet, it landed even harder. Tom blinked and immediately tried to pull the conversation back into safer territory. He insisted that his point had been about public image and nothing more. Royal presentation, media expectations, the way historic roles carried certain emotional and visual associations. He argued that he had been talking about how people responded to symbols, not making a personal attack on Catherine. William didn't move. Tom kept explaining. He talked about the pressure attached to the title, the comparisons created by newspapers, the reality that every Princess of Wales would inevitably be viewed through the lens of history. He tried to transform his comments into an abstract discussion about monarchy, branding, memory, and public perception. But William refused to let him, because that wasn't what had happened. Tom hadn't criticized a communication strategy. He had questioned Catherine's character. William made the distinction with brutal clarity. Catherine had never asked to be Diana. She had never claimed to be Diana. She had never entered the family pretending that she could replace the woman who had been William's mother. And she had never needed to. The title came with history. Everyone understood that. And Catherine understood it better than most. But carrying history was not the same as exploiting it. William's voice grew tighter. Tom had taken every quality Catherine had spent years demonstrating in public and recast it as calculation. He had suggested that kindness could be a technique, that restraint could be theater, that warmth could be strategy. And then he had used Diana to reinforce the accusation. That was the part William couldn't ignore. His mother was not a comparison chart. She wasn't a collection of gestures for someone else to imitate. And she certainly wasn't a weapon Tom could pick up during a family dinner and use against William's wife. The room had fallen completely silent. Camilla looked from William to Tom and seemed to understand, perhaps faster than anyone else, just how badly the conversation had deteriorated. Her son had done far more than make an uncomfortable remark. He had brought Diana into a room that contained Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine all at the same time. There was hardly another name capable of reopening old divisions so quickly. Camilla tried to intervene carefully. She suggested that Tom's comments had been misunderstood. She explained that he had been speaking more generally about public expectations and the burden that came with royal roles. It was an attempt to lower the temperature without directly defending what had been said. William didn't accept it. He glanced toward Camilla briefly before turning his attention back to Tom. Misunderstood? No. The meaning had been perfectly clear. If Tom had wanted to discuss media strategy, he could have discussed media strategy. If he wanted to talk about historical comparisons, he could have done that as well. But he had crossed a line. He had suggested that Catherine knew exactly what image people wanted and had deliberately shaped herself around it. That wasn't theoretical. That was personal. And William wasn't willing to let it go. Catherine remained seated. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't ask him to stop. She didn't use the opportunity to attack either Tom or Camilla. She simply watched while William defended a boundary that, until that evening, no one at the table had been reckless enough to challenge so openly. William's anger was no longer hidden. It remained controlled. It remained measured. But it was impossible to miss. He told Tom that Catherine had spent years being compared to everyone except herself. Every outfit, every photograph, every public appearance, everything had been measured against someone else's memory. And she had carried that burden without allowing those comparisons to become resentment. Now, Tom wanted to use that very pressure as evidence that she had manufactured her identity. William wasn't going to allow that. Across the table, Tom's expression had changed. The confidence was gone. He began offering another explanation. But William cut him off with a question no one expected. Was this really something Tom had only thought of tonight? The atmosphere shifted again. Because that question was no longer about a single comment. It was about where that comment had come from. Tom hesitated, only for a moment, but everyone noticed it. William noticed it, too. He asked again, this time more quietly. Was this the first time Tom had spoken about Catherine in those terms? Camilla's expression tightened. For the first time, Catherine looked up. Tom opened his mouth, but no answer came. And before he could decide what to say, Charles finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't tell William to sit down. He didn't rush to defend Tom. For several seconds, he simply looked across the table. First at Catherine, then at Tom. It was as though he was trying to decide whether there was still a graceful way to rescue the evening. There wasn't. When Charles finally spoke, his words were brief. Tom owed Catherine an apology. That was it. No speech, no lecture, no attempt to soften the message. And somehow, that made the rebuke even more powerful. Only a few minutes earlier, Charles had been describing Catherine as one of the people helping carry the monarchy into the future. Tom had taken that conversation and turned it into something toxic. Now, Charles had drawn a line of his own. Tom looked toward Camilla, and Camilla found herself trapped. If she challenged William, she risked making the insult appear even worse. If she openly condemned Tom, she would be criticizing her own son in front of the entire family. And if she said nothing, the silence itself would raise questions. So she remained silent, and that was when the atmosphere shifted once again. The argument was no longer focused solely on whether Tom had gone too far. William believed Charles had already made his position clear. The bigger issue was the question Tom still hadn't answered. Why had he been so comfortable saying it? Tom made one final attempt to retreat into explanation. He insisted that his comments were about image, about the way public figures understood expectations, about how certain roles carried historical memories that influenced public perception. But William heard nothing except avoidance, because the question was much simpler than that. Had Tom thought this before? Had he said it before? And perhaps most importantly, who else had been speaking about Catherine that way? Tom never gave a direct answer. Instead, he spoke around the question. He said people made these comparisons all the time. He pointed out that the media did it constantly, but William hadn't asked about newspapers. He had asked about people inside the family, and that distinction lingered in the room. Catherine still said nothing. She could have turned the moment against Tom. She could have demanded an apology. She could have asked Camilla whether she agreed with her son's comments. But she did none of those things. Her restraint became the most uncomfortable part of the evening. Tom had just accused her of manufacturing dignity for public approval. And there she sat, without cameras, without an audience, refusing to humiliate the man who had just humiliated her. William noticed. So did Charles. And so did Camilla. The irony was impossible to ignore. Tom had accused Catherine of performing grace, while Catherine was giving everyone at the table the strongest possible evidence that grace doesn't require an audience. Then came the apology. It wasn't dramatic. Tom said he hadn't intended to insult her. He admitted that his point had been poorly expressed and acknowledged that the comparison had gone too far. But the apology didn't answer William's question. Where had the idea come from? That was the issue that remained unresolved. The dinner never truly recovered. Conversations tried to restart but quickly faded. Charles spoke very little. Camilla remained guarded, and Tom had completely lost the confidence he had shown earlier in the evening. Catherine finally spoke, but only enough to bring the confrontation to an end. She didn't retaliate. She didn't try to punish him. She simply made it clear that the subject had gone far enough. That should have been the end of it. For William, it wasn't. An insult can be answered. An apology can be accepted. A careless comment can be blamed on poor judgment. But hesitation is different. Tom had hesitated when William asked whether he had spoken this way before. And that hesitation became the one detail William couldn't ignore. Was it simply discomfort? Was Tom searching for the right words? Or had William touched on something Tom never expected to be questioned about? No one at the table answered. Camilla didn't. Tom didn't. Charles didn't press him. And Catherine, still refusing to make the evening even more painful, allowed the silence to remain. The dinner slowly began to fall apart. Chairs shifted, voices lowered. People started leaving the table with the forced politeness of a gathering that had ended long before anyone was willing to admit it. William stayed close to Catherine. Tom remained behind with Camilla. And what had started as a discussion about Catherine's future within the monarchy had ended with a far more troubling question. Who had been talking about Catherine when William wasn't there? That was the question that followed him out of the room. And in the end, it wasn't Tom's insult that stayed with William. It was the question Tom never answered. The evening ended without anyone formally bringing it to a close. There was no return to casual conversation. The room had simply run out of places to go. Catherine stood quietly, gathered herself, and left the table with the same composure she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. She didn't ask anyone to follow her. She didn't have to. William was already moving toward the door behind her. And that was the moment the atmosphere truly changed. Tom's comment, which may have sounded sharp or even insightful when it first entered his mind, had become something entirely different. He had tried to frame it as an observation about image and history. Instead, it had exposed a fracture within the family. Camilla remained seated, caught between embarrassment and frustration. Her son had crossed a line in front of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and there was no easy way to repair the damage. Charles understood it as well. The evening had been meant to symbolize stability, continuity, and confidence in the next generation. Instead, it became a reminder of how quickly old wounds can reopen. But William's anger had never really been about clothing. It wasn't about photographs. And it wasn't even about the fact that people had compared Catherine to Diana for years. The real wound was much deeper. Tom had questioned whether Catherine's goodness truly belonged to her. That was the accusation hidden beneath everything else. Her warmth could be rehearsed. Her restraint could be calculated. Her ability to connect with people could be learned rather than genuine. And Britain's affection for her could simply be the result of knowing which memories to awaken. That was what brought William to his feet. Because William knew the woman behind the public image. He knew who Catherine was when there were no cameras in the room. He knew how she carried pressure before events began and after they ended. He knew the difference between something performed for an audience and something lived in private. Tom had reduced all of that to image. Then he had connected that image to Diana. For William, that crossed two emotional boundaries at once. His wife had been diminished, and his mother's memory had been used to do it. That's why Tom's attempts to hide behind phrases like public perception never worked. William had already heard the argument beneath the language. The suggestion wasn't that Catherine was simply being herself. The suggestion was that she had created a carefully assembled version of a Princess Britain already missed. And William couldn't accept that. Not in silence, and certainly not at his own family's table. But after the anger faded, one question remained. Tom Parker Bowles wasn't an outsider writing a newspaper column or offering commentary from a television studio. He was Camilla's son. He had been sitting only a few feet away from William and Catherine when he felt comfortable enough to say what he said. So where had the idea come from? Had he formed the opinion on his own? Had years of public comparisons shaped his thinking? Or had similar conversations taken place behind closed doors when William wasn't present? There was no answer. William had asked a direct question. Tom never gave him a direct response. And that's why the evening remained unresolved. Because a cruel remark can be challenged, an apology can be accepted, and a boundary can be drawn. But an unanswered question does something entirely different. It stays. If Tom had been willing to say those words while sitting directly across from William, what had been said when William wasn't in the room? That was the one question the dinner could never answer. And perhaps that's the part that matters most. The insult was painful, but the silence surrounding its origin was even worse, because it suggested that the idea might not have been new. It had simply found its way to the dinner table.